What is the future of human civilization? Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and I'm super stoked because today I'm going to review the science fiction novel by Jack Vance called Inferio. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I'm really excited because I recently read a novel called Inferio by Jack Vance, which is a science fiction novel that was featured in this collection put out by the Library of America, which is American science fiction, 4 classic novels from 1968 to 1969, and is a 2-volume set with science fiction novels from the 60s. And so one of the stories in this collection was the novel Inferio by Jack Vance. I had wanted to read Jack Vance before just because I was curious what his brand of science fiction was, so to speak, and I was very excited to read his book. So, being honest, I have very much been taken in by science fiction recently. I have been deeply immersed in a variety of different science fiction texts, whether we're talking about short stories by fantasy and science fiction magazines such as Clarkesworld and the magazine of science fiction and fantasy and science fiction, as well as Dune, which I also watched the movie, because I was very curious about how that story would be depicted. I've been thinking about it in terms of Philip K. Dick and his work, such as Blade Runner, which is known in its novel version as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I recently watched Blade Runner, which was really exciting. And I've also been reading the science fiction from other collections of short stories. So I'm super stoked because this was one that I had definitely wanted to read and that I'm very excited to be able to talk about. Now, to give you a little bit of background with the plot, Inferio is about the father-son relationship between 2 characters, Amiante, who is the father, and Jill Tarvok, I believe is how you would pronounce it, who is the son. And there is a little bit of a coming-of-age element because there is very much this notion of Jill as being someone who is growing up. So some of the earliest scenes in the book are him as a kid and his adventures in this wide cosmos of possibility and literally of other planets and moons and civilizations, which I think is very powerful. And so I'm very excited to talk a little bit about this plot line to be able to then dive into the themes. So basically, to give you some background, the characters in this world are in a place where they are unable to mass produce their art. So Amiante, for example, is an artisan, and he makes wood carvings. And what's really interesting about this character is he's very much thoughtful like an artist, but he does have a, I would describe, subversive side to him. And so I did want to say that it's very interesting to build a science fiction story around individuals with their own vision and their own uniqueness and sometimes with a subversive quality or attitude in the context of an overarching structure of society which deals with governments, for example, or civilizations and institutions who stamp down on people and who tell them what to do. And so the artisans in this world are unable to mass produce anything, and it seems that part of the reason is so that way they control the production, and that way basically they can control not only the means of production but also wealth, is what it seems to me from reading the story. Now, Jill is close with his father and loves his father very much, and it is very tragic because Amiante later on subverts the law and gets warnings and still subverts the law. And when he does this, he is executed. And so this makes Jill want to rebel. and to want to try to understand what's going on in the world, or worlds around him, and to see what civilization is really all about. Now, it's important to talk about an archetypal character in this story, which is the character Inferio, which Jill, as a younger kid, is able to see depicted as a puppet in a puppet show, and Inferio is an archetype. Seems to be an archetype of someone who stands against injustice in the world, who makes a stand. And so his character is very much a part of what Jill is looking towards whenever he's making his decisions in life. Now, after Amiante is executed, Joe goes on in his adventure, and he has a lot of things that happen. As you can imagine, I will leave a lot of it to the imagination, but suffice to say, the book gets very interesting because it starts to develop a theme. And the theme is that can one person, with their individuality, remember this was written in the 60s during the counter-revolution, the counterculture, which was very much focused on this idea of individualism and being able to come to the truth to yourself and being able to stand against society. And so what's interesting about this story is very much Jill is determined to stand against society and to change reality, to change society and civilization, and to change the rules that everybody follows. And so the reason why this is interesting is because it taps into this notion of whether or not a person is able to resist the way that things are on a large social entrenched level. Especially when you're talking about civilizations that span across many different planets and worlds. It's definitely something to think about. And I wanted to say that part of the reason why I have been thinking about science fiction lately is because it does two things well. One is it is able to project out into an imaginary space, whether it's the future or a different world or a different context that's alien from our own. And it's able to project this in an abstract space through storytelling. And I think that there's a lot of value in there. But I'll admit, I also have an interest in a very loose sense of politics, which is how humans behave, how their society affects them in kind of a sociological way, and with thinking about how people come to believe what they believe and represent that in the society at large. And so science fiction is very good at projecting that space. And so I do have a review of Lou Cixin's Three-Body Problem, which I think goes into politics in this way, with thinking about how humans operate on a social, individual, and ideological level. But Jack Vance is interesting because he does something similar by thinking about this oppressive government, basically, this state, which is controlling people and what they can do, and what they can make, and their ambitions, controlling their ambitions. And so I very much am taken in by this question of what is the political value of an individual? How can they influence things? And so I would say that the book is pretty hopeful about this kind of idea because it's describing how, at the end, how you find out that Jill, despite all of his struggles, and despite losing his father when he was fairly young, and despite struggling with the system, he was able to nonetheless overturn it and to make the world free by doing what he was doing in the plot of this novel. And I find that to be a fascinating theme. But the question that I want to ask is whether or not Jill was moral. And so this is where I think it gets even more complicated with thinking about the space of fiction to imagine new worlds, to be abstract, to imagine and extrapolate things from narrative that very much apply to our lives and very much apply to what we're thinking about. And that would be the question, was Jill moral? And I think he struggled with it. So for instance, there's a scene about halfway through the novel where Jill, with some pirates, overtakes a space yacht, and he does this with his sneaky way of doing this by having the information that he had about when the space yacht was even going to be there. And it's very gray, because Jill is saying that he doesn't want anyone to get hurt. That was what they agreed on, and Jill does get betrayed later by the pirates that he was working with. but he also wanted to steal, and he wanted to have power. And I don't want to make a simplistic case about morality. For sure, that's the last thing I want to do. But I'll admit there are some scenes where Jill seems to be struggling with his morality, because even though he doesn't want to do things that other people are doing that he finds to be unethical, he still facilitates some things that happen in the course of the novel that may or may not be ethical. And so this is what I get out of it, which is that the struggle to stand against society is not so black and white. Individuals are not perfect, and we do things that may have moral ambiguity and may not always be good. And so one of the themes that I definitely get out of this book is that we have to be in that gray territory whenever we are trying to change the world. We are going to do things that may not be so moral. And I think this is important to keep in mind because we always think that the fight against evil, the fight against corrupt social structures, is by being completely virtuous. But as the character Jill figures out, he figures out that Inferio was more of a representation, which was therefore almost an empty representation, where Inferio wasn't who Jill thought that he was. He wasn't who this archetype, he wasn't the archetype that Jill thought that he was. And so this is the thing, is that you have to struggle with your morality, and you have to struggle with your beliefs and ideologies and your politics, and you have to struggle to be able to either stand against society or assert your own independence. And while it's fair to criticize individuality as a flawed way of looking at the world, which is fair because individuals may not actually be able to change the world and be able to change entrenched systems and structures. But what's important to keep in mind is that if you are trying to discover yourself and discover the world and approach and confront society and the world in which we live in, you're probably going to end up in that gray area where sometimes you do things that are not always the best. Or at least your morality is ambiguous, as it is in the case of this character Jill. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this book, aside from the fact that I thought it was very entertaining, that the kind of space opera approach of this world unfolding in, or of this story unfolding in a cosmic background of many different planets and worlds, I nonetheless think that it's also important for what it says about these themes that I've discussed and what I internalize as a new way of thinking about the world. This is what I think fiction in general does well, and what science fiction can do well as well, which is capture this space to be able to imagine new worlds, new things, to be able to extrapolate beliefs from a fictional framework, and to be able to understand more and more the world in which we live in. Because I think that politics in the world as it is today is, as it has always been if you look at history, is very messy. And so to be able to have an abstract space to think about these things in a way that is a little bit more free, I think is really important. Because I decided that for my own understanding of the character Jill, I don't want to necessarily see him as being good or bad. I see him as a political actor who was conveying his beliefs to the world and who was fighting for what he believed in, and I think that's admirable. But the reality is, the world is gray, and sometimes we can't change the world, and sometimes we do things that we shouldn't have done. We are in ethical ambiguity and grayness. And I think it's also very true that we often think that our politics and our views and our beliefs and ideologies are right, but it might just be that they are also flawed, and that they lead us astray. That even the idea underpinning this novel of individuality might actually be misguided, because it may not actually be helpful to look at ourselves as strictly sovereign agents with an individuality that is not influenced by the outside world, and that you and you alone can change the powerful structures in place, the powerful social structures. But I do nonetheless want to say that having this character, Jill, try to embody some of these ideals is definitely what makes the space of fiction very interesting. And I would also add that maybe it's even a little bit admirable for a character to try to embody an archetype such as Inferio, and to try to be better than he was before, and to try to basically save the world. And I think that that's a very interesting theme. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope that you enjoyed this discussion on Jack Vance's book Inferio, and I hope that you'll check it out. I think it's a very interesting science fiction novel, which captures a lot of the interesting things that science fiction can do as a genre, and I hope that you will check it out. I also encourage you to check out my other videos on my channel, and I encourage you to also check out my other book reviews as well. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. I will see you next time.